So today, the topic is very topical, very timely, a Belt and Road Initiative that we've been all hearing about for the last several years, a major initiative on the part of China and its partners. I think it's got at least two dimensions of significance, the Belt and Road Initiative. One is that it's a series of mega projects, huge construction, design, engineering projects. And those of you interested in mega projects, by the way, a good source to look up is ENR News, Engineering News Record industry publication, which covers the industry, the construction, engineering, design industries, and that's one sector I try to follow. The other, so apart from the economic significance of this initiative, the other interesting part is the geopolitical discussion behind it. China's supremacy in the region and establishing and fortifying relationships with its neighbors. So we've got Manuel Serapio. I'll just say a few things about Manuel. He's, of course, one of our partners as a cyber director at the University of Colorado, Denver. He's been an innovative educator, certainly a distinguished name in international entrepreneurship. And as we have just heard, the cyber at UC Denver has done a lot in terms of getting us close to Asia Pacific, in particular China, through faculty development programs, research, and outreach programs. So Manuel, it's really good to see you here. Thank you for organizing this very special session with our key speaker, Dr. Rafiq Dossani. Rafiq is, of course, is a senior economist at the RAND Corporation, and we all know about RAND, or we should, because they are a major research and policy center, a nonprofit that's been around for a long time and supporting us with a lot of evidence-based research and policy issues. Rafiq directs the RAND Center for Asia Pacific Policy at the RAND Corporation. He does a lot of research and sessions like this on education, finance, trade, security, and other issues. He previously worked at Stanford University. He was the director of the Stanford Asia Pacific Center also. So with that, Rafiq, thank you so much for your willingness to share your expertise today with us. We're looking forward to getting enlightened, and we will have some time for questions. So I encourage everybody to use the Q&A icon on your screen to register your comments and questions. And welcome to you, Rafiq.
Thank you, Tamir. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Manuel, for facilitating this. I'm very happy to be here and to share my understandings of the Belt and Road Initiative. As you mentioned, Tamir, the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, is something that's been in the news. It's been in the news because it's a very large economic initiative as well as a large geopolitical initiative. Yet at the same time, understanding its contours is important because it's also many more things. It's the world's largest development finance initiative as well. You know, it has a certain scale of operation that's unprecedented in development finance history. So it's from those points of view, the BRI in some ways is underreported. You know, people or media or politicians talk more about its geopolitical aspects and also its economic sides, but how it comes together as a network of activities that together make in some ways a coherent whole are things that I think are worth talking about. So with that, I'm going to just start my presentation. Give me a moment. So here is a map of the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. You see that a number of lines on them. On this map, some of them are what's called the land route, which is a set of roads, railway links, pipelines. And then there's the sea route, of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is lower down in the blue lines, which covers a number of port areas and connections between them. The idea of showing you this map is to give you a sense of its scale, which countries are involved. As you can see, it extends all the way from China all the way across east to the rest of Asia. It doesn't look too much to the further east of China, Japan, and so on, but it then picks up again in a map that I haven't shown in the Pacific Islands, and the Belt and Road Initiative actually is quite active there as well. But heading west, you can see it goes all the way to Europe on the land side as well as on the ocean side. So it's a big, huge initiative that that is underway. I hope you also get a sense of how things are linked to China. So, for example, you don't see Tehran and Moscow that directly connected up. You have to go through China or in a circuitous way to get to some of these locations. So in that sense, it's very much centered around China, and we'll want to talk about what that means from various angles in a moment. So these are the topics I plan to cover in my presentation. First, I'll explain a bit about what the BRI is, what is different about it compared with other similar initiatives going on right now or historically. What are the issues it raises, for the host country that receives the BRI as a set of projects? What are the things that they are looking for, and what sort of impacts is the BRI expected to have? And then I'll turn to the evidence. What do we know about the BRI? It's already 7 years in its history. It was started in 2013, so this is year 7. We already have evidence of many projects, and what can we learn from them? And then hopefully that can take us into a discussion. So with that, what I'd like you to note when we look at the land route is its scope. So, and as an example, you can see that in 2011, in that box, there were 17 train trips between China and Europe carrying goods worth 600 million. So it was just a small fraction of the total trade between China and Europe. Most of the trade takes place between China and Europe takes place through air and mostly by sea, by ocean liners. Here, so not surprisingly, in 2011, the land route didn't account for much. But 5 years into the BRI in 2018, there were 6,000 train trips between China and Europe, carrying goods worth 16 billion. And it has gone up significantly even since 2018, mainly to Belarus, Germany, and Poland, but now much more widely into Turkey, into Greece, into Austria. The goods carried include a range of items, electronic items, wine, vehicles, and apparel. And it's a two-way trade, so the trains go relatively full on both ways. Interestingly, things like vehicles, you'd think it might be a one-way trade of expensive Mercedes-Benzes coming from Germany to China, but not so. Actually, it's a two-way trade where Chinese vehicles that are at the low end, much cheaper, but they're very good with small cars, go to Eastern Europe, while more expensive high-end vehicles come from Germany to China. Now, this makes sense only if you can ship goods not just at a reasonable cost. Clearly, rail travel is relatively cheap compared to air travel and as well as ocean travel, but you need to save time also to make sense for it. So what we see is as an example, the time to ship freight from Xi'an, China, which is on the eastern side, you can see just below Beijing in the map, to Ankara, Turkey, which is a distance of 4,100 miles, has fallen over these years from 30 days by rail and sea to 12 days by rail due to the BRI rail link between the two cities. Now, this map as a land route gives you some sense of it. It's not yet complete. There's a number of high-speed rail links for passenger travel. There's a number of other rail links for freight that are coming up between all these links. So it's not just road, it's road and rail as well. So that's half the BRI. The other half is the sea route. And here that's what you see in this map. In this map, you see a number of boxes or sort of rectangles. That's where China is building its ports. So it has contracts to build ports all the way from Greece, Piraeus in Greece, to Djibouti and Nairobi in northern and eastern Africa, to Gwadar port in Pakistan in South Asia, to ports in Sri Lanka. There are a number of ports in Sri Lanka being built by China. Hambantota is mentioned, but Colombo is also there, and some very large projects. There are ports in other parts of South Asia, in Bangladesh, which is I hope you can see, it says Kolkata, but means Bangladesh. Gyeokphu in Myanmar, Sihanoukville in Cambodia. So a large number of ports are being built, including in the South China Sea, as you can see. And there are other projects in the South China Sea. For example, China is building a rail line, several rail lines in Cambodia and Laos, and the Lao Republic, a high-speed rail link in Indonesia, also in Malaysia, one of which was in the news recently due to some corruption scandals. So what I hope to show, what this I hope tells you is that it's a very large initiative. In fact, it's the world's largest development finance initiative. It's about 3 times the size of what the World Bank does every year, which is significant because till then, we've always thought of the World Bank as leading development finance. And here comes China, and is not just large, but it's 3 times as large. And what's interesting about this is also that China is still a poor country. Most development finance consists of money either provided directly through US aid, for example, to poor countries, or channeled via the World Bank and other development banks, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, to poor countries. But here you have China doing this as still an emerging country. It's not a rich country by any means. Its per capita income is 1/3 of the OECD averages. And so that's one important aspect of the BRI. Second is, as this table shows, it's active right across with a large number of projects. And China has invested more than $80 billion in over 70 participating countries since the launch of the BRI. What's more, China not only finances, it also builds. So again, unlike the World Bank or US aid, where the money is given and then the actual construction of the projects is left to countries to decide, with considerable amount of influence from the lending country. All aid is tied aid, which means that when a country gives aid, it requires more or less that the projects be executed by companies from the lending country. And that's no different from China. About 70% of project implementation is by Chinese firms, particularly state-owned Chinese firms. So with its scale, there are other unique features of the BRI. One is, as the map probably already indicated to you, it's about connectivity. So the BRI doesn't invest in any kind of infrastructure. There's a focus on connectivity infrastructure, and not just that, global connectivity. That is roads and other transport systems, electricity grids, gas and oil pipelines that can not just connect up a country within a country, but one country to another. So that global connectivity has been an important feature of the BRI, which is quite unique. There's been no project or set of projects that have focused so much on global connectivity as the BRI has done. The second feature that's different about the BRI, and I'll show you examples of these as we go along. The second important unique feature of the BRI is it's at national level scales. What this means is that in the past, if you look at foreign aid projects and even countries' own projects, poor countries don't have money. So they rely on foreign aid to help them out. But most foreign aid is quite small relative to the total needs of a country. And that's what you'd normally expect, right? You'd say, well, if a country is receiving foreign aid, it can't expect to solve all its problems in transportation and electricity from one project. But then along comes the BRI almost with an open checkbook, enabling countries to get national level scale. And I'll show you examples in a moment. And the third unique feature of the BRI is that it's not just about scale, it's also about comprehensiveness. So it's not just about roads, it's also about pipelines, it's about grids, it's about hospitals, it's about schools. So there's an approach to comprehensive area development. What the BRI does is it takes corridors and says, let's focus on developing everything along this corridor. So along this corridor, there'd be a road, there'd be a rail line, but there'd also be hubs around the corridors where there might be resources of skills, or it might be resources of natural resources, which are also developed. And the fourth unique feature of the BRI is that it's state financed and state implemented. And that's important from a certain point of view, that we'd be concerned to see whether these are efficiently done projects. But there's a lot of a view out there that state financed and state implemented projects by nature are inefficient because there's no private incentive. The profit incentive might be missing. So let's look at that. So now I'll provide you with some examples of projects. First, one of the largest is in Pakistan, called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. You would have seen it in the map I showed earlier. So this is a set of, and obviously it's going to be hard to read all of these, but later on when you get the slides, if you want them, or the working paper, you can get into the details. But some highlights are, spending of $34 billion over 6 years to raise electricity capacity from 28 gigawatts to 45 gigawatts. So just reflect on that for a moment. This is a country, Pakistan, that in 2017 had national electricity capacity of 28 gigawatts. That's 28,000 megawatts. And with these China finance projects, that is going to rise by 60% to 45 gigawatts. In other words, the scale of electricity in Pakistan is just being transformed with this project. Pakistan has already moved from being a chronically power deficit country to being in power surplus. So that won't last, because as the country develops, it'll need this power. Just to give you a sense of comparison, California, where I live, its total capacity is in excess of 45 gigawatts. So it's nowhere near developed country levels, but you can see how transformative it is for Pakistan. Second, the aspect of comprehensive development. It's not just power, but fiber, transport, all of these. And I hope you get a sense of these corridors from the map on the left of the text. And finally, outside the Belt and Road Initiative, to give you a sense of how this is very different from what's happened before, the largest aid project that Pakistan ever got was a World Bank loan of 382 million for a bus system in Karachi. So now here's the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor that has invested not just 34 billion in electricity, but several other billion. The total is 62 billion over a 10-year period, which is, about 6 billion a year, whereas Pakistan, historically, their largest project ever prior to this was just 382 million. So I hope that gives you a sense of the scale. And this is happening in country after country. So another example is Myanmar, where China has been investing in a corridor that goes from Kyaukphyu, which incidentally is in the troubled Rakhine province. Those who've been following the Rohingya refugee crisis would know that the Rohingya come from this area. It's been a site of extensive ethnic conflict. And yet China has gone into this area, into one of the most troubled areas at the request of the government of Myanmar, which sees that these projects might stabilize the region. And China's taken a big risk. So the Kyaukphyu project has a total level of investments of several billion. As you can see, there's a port, a deep sea port of 3 billion. The energy pipelines that are featured in this map of 2 billion, and a railway running alongside the pipelines where China will be investing another 3 billion. I hope this brings out to you another feature of the BRI, which is that it's also intended to connect the poorer regions of China to the world. So Kunming, which is in Yunnan province, is a relatively poor area of China, which is now going to be connected to the world through this through the pipelines and the transportation systems of the Myanmar project, whereas otherwise to connect with the world, Kunming goods had to go take an extensive land route across China and then to the ports on the eastern seaboard. So this will help the development of the poorer regions of China, which is one of the objectives of China. And my third example is in Africa. I wanted to give you a sense of activities, not just in Asia, but in many other parts of the world. So an example is the Mombasa-Nairobi standard gauge railway in Kenya, which was developed and completed in a period of 3 years at a cost of 3.2 billion. It connects the two major cities of Kenya, Mombasa and Nairobi. I hope you can see those on the bottom right, the port of Mombasa, where China is also building a port. And then now that the Mombasa-Nairobi link is complete, this project will now go on to other countries as well, including Uganda, Rwanda, and South Sudan. What's remarkable is that it's Kenya's biggest infrastructure project since 1963, and the first railway built in Kenya in the past 100 years. I mean, these numbers are in a sense staggering, that a country like Kenya, which is an important country, has not been able to get support globally till the BRI came along for something as fundamental as this for decades. The last project of this size was not even of this size, it was much smaller, it was in millions of dollars, was in 1963. So I think that's very telling about the scope and aims and how the BRI is going to change geopolitics as well. You can imagine the impact on Kenya when these projects are completed. And by the way, China has several other projects in Kenya, roads and pipelines as well. My final example is of Colombo, which is in South Asia, the capital of Sri Lanka, where China, and I put this in to give you a sense of comprehensive development. So it's not just transportation and infrastructure, but China is also building, industrial zones and financial centers. So Colombo International Financial City, coming on top of several other projects by China in Colombo and in the port area. China already runs ports in Colombo, and very successfully so. So the port city is being developed by a state-owned company. It will invest 15 billion will be reclaiming 270 hectares of land. The common infrastructure is almost complete, will be ready in another year, and it will have a floor area of 5.7 million square meters when complete. So really a mega project to rival Dubai and Singapore, at least those are the ambitions. It has raised certain issues, for example, environmental issues. Fishermen have complained about livelihoods being affected, and these are areas of public policy that the BRI must address. So let me turn now to the public policy issues of the BRI, and then I'll wrap up my presentation. So the first is that there have been many criticisms of the BRI, and among the issues of concern there are several. I've just listed 6 of them in this slide and the next. The first is because these projects are so large, China is able to make countries dependent on it, and it will use that dependence to get privileged access to the country's resources and markets. So this, in a sense, is a reprise of the colonialist argument. You know, when Britain went into Africa or to India, what it did was it forced those countries to close down their industries. For example, the Indian textile industry was shut down by Britain, and all the raw cotton of India was forcibly exported to Britain to build up Britain's textile industry. So these are shades of this sort of argument, and the question is whether China is doing that in these host countries. Second is that the project gives unusual benefits to China, renminbi internationalization, the growth of regional infrastructure networks, as we saw with China at the hub. Third is whether environmental skills development and other sustainable development goals are being neglected. Moving on, whether China is just sending its capital and people abroad to run uneconomic projects because of payoffs on the side, or just because of those countries are not clear about what they want. And that's been a criticism. The second last criticism I list here, debt trap lending, has been in the news that China's lending so much and at such uneconomic rates then can be paid back that it will make the country dependent on China. This is a very unusual one. As an economist, it's pretty rare to think of debt trap from a debtor's point of view. One normally thinks of a debt trap from the lender's point of view, that lenders would want to avoid a debt trap as much as possible. But yet this criticism has been made. And we'll come to the evidence. And finally, the compliance standards, corruption. It's being argued that the BRI finances corruption in many countries. So let's see what the evidence is. So one is the argument that China is sending all its capital and it's a way to employ Chinese laborers who otherwise have no jobs. This by and large, I think, has been comprehensively rejected as with the evidence. I quote one piece of evidence of about 400 projects in Africa, a study by Soutman and Han from a South African institute. And many other studies have looked at these. By and large, they find that about 15 to 20% of the employees are Chinese. And most of them are at the supervisory level, and that percentage comes down over time. So for example, in Zambia, where the BRI has been active for many years, the percentage of Chinese employees started at around 25% and is now down to about 12%. So I think we can reject this. And those of you who are economists will be aware of the theory of comparative advantage. It doesn't make sense for China to export both capital and labor. It would make sense if it had a comparative advantage in one of them to export that. But it's clear that China's advantage is in capital exports and not in labor exports. In fact, labor rates in China are high enough that many activities, even in textiles, low-end industries, have moved out of China and into countries like Vietnam. So it's pretty unlikely that China will need to export labor to countries that are still poorer than Southeast Asia, like Kazakhstan or Africa and so on. The second is resource exploitation, that China sets up these industries to take away natural resources. So this has been studied. I recommend the citation here, and you can get more details on it from my working paper. That Qingquan Li did a very good study over 7 years of how China is seen as a resource user in Zambia, in Africa, where it is active in the copper mining area. And the evidence suggests that unlike the private firms in Zambia, which tend to hire and fire labor at will to exploit the copper in some uneconomic ways in terms of using blast mining rather than other more sustainable ways of mining, China has actually been a much more stable long-term manager. And the reason is quite simple. They are a strategic investor. They want to be there for many years. Whereas the private industries, they are quite happy getting in and out as quickly as possible. On the third criticism about debt trap lending, the evidence suggests, and again, I have references in our paper, that these are loans made typically at rates of 2% or lower. So it's slightly more than World Bank rates, which is 1.7%, but well below commercial rates of 6 to 7%. And second, from a debt trap point of view, again, those who are economists will recognize the argument more readily that you don't get into a debt trap unless your GDP growth falls below your borrowing rate. And most of the countries that China lends to have been growing at rates well above 2%. For example, Myanmar is about 6%, so is Sri Lanka in those examples that I gave you, so is Kenya. So there's no question of a debt trap. And the record shows not a single evidence of actual countries having fallen into the debt trap, despite 7 years having passed. Looking at uneconomic projects, the most cited example is Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, which has been deemed a white elephant if you check the press. But in fact, that's not the case. The port defaulted on its payments because it didn't have enough business. But it continues to be developed. The port is now being run by a Chinese firm in consortium with a local firm. That firm, the Chinese and local firm, won the right to run the port based on a competitive bidding process that was overseen by a Nigerian firm. So it was quite transparent the way it happened. So even that doesn't indicate evidence of uneconomic projects. Now, but there are a couple of areas where more work is needed, where there is preliminary evidence of problems. One is in terms of corruption. There's some evidence, and again, Lee's book on Zambia indicates this, not in the copper industry, but other industries, particularly construction industries, that where China behaves like other firms in the industry. And there is evidence of unethical and corrupt business practices in weak institutional environments, which are typical of those countries. Second, the environmental commitments. China is committed to environmental and SDGs. Generally, it has signed an agreement with the United Nations Development Program to follow their rules on environmental and SDG commitments. But to date, there is some evidence that this has not been adequately measured, and there are some areas where they're off for concern. And in many cases, that's because in those countries, the institutions are still weak. So environmental monitors don't work well. So it's part of the problem might be that China is taking advantage of that, but part of the problem might just be that we don't know, and more evidence is needed. There's certainly gains for China. All BRI contracts are in renminbi. Chinese firms obtain the lion's share of contracts. China is at the hub. And, the last one, the soft power angle, we're used to thinking of soft power as being very important, the image of a country. And China has not been successful in promoting its image. It's an authoritarian country who's going into countries which are aspiring to be viable, flourishing democracies in many of these cases. Sri Lanka is a democracy, so is Kenya. Sometimes weak democracies, but authoritarian regimes are not their stated goal. And so China does have a problem with image, but infrastructure helps it. If you're going to have rail links and road systems and power plants all running on Chinese-built infrastructure, operated by Chinese companies, using Chinese systems, that's a source of soft power. Of course, there are gains for the host country, as we already talked about national level scale, the need for infrastructure, comprehensive development, and public goods like sustainable development, especially skills development. America has not joined the BRI. This is just the final point I want to make. It was invited by China to do so, but recently, because of geopolitics, America has been rather concerned, particularly in the South China Sea. And as you know, I showed this graph earlier, you get a sense of why America is concerned. 1/3 of the world's shipping trade passes through the South China Sea. I hope you see that on the right side of this map. And China is very active in building ports there, in reclaiming land features, and all of these things are of great strategic concern to the US. In my opinion, I think the US also ought to be concerned about the land route, which is building China's influence significantly in Central Asia. I don't think there ought to be, I think the US ought to recognize the rise of China and see how it can accommodate that. But if you want, we can discuss that in the question and answer. Let me wrap up with that and back to you, Tamir.
Thank you so much, Rafiq. That was very educational for me, for sure. Very informative. You gave us a very good overview. There's quite a few questions. I guess one of the questions you already answered. Our colleague Linda Gerber was interested in learning about the involvement of local labor. And you clarified that it's essentially local labor with very little Chinese labor being transported to these destinations where the projects are ongoing. I'd like to learn a little bit more about the nature of each project. I mean, do these fit the what we call the BOT model, build, operate, and transfer? That is, these projects, for example, Port Authority, is the control, ownership still on the part of the China, which is providing the financing, with the intention that after some period, 20 years, 30 years, they will turn it over to a local government or local sponsor.
Yes, that is the nature of most of the projects. For example, the Myanmar project, the Kyaukphyu Deep Sea Port, is a joint venture of the Myanmar government and the Chinese government and a local consortium of private firms. About 15% of the project is held by the Myanmar government. The project itself is on a long-term lease. I don't remember the exact term, but it varies. In the case, I think it's about 30 years for the port and 30 years for the railway. But those tenures vary. For example, Hambantota Port is on a 99-year lease. Now, the lease contracts come with terms such as no military use, for example. So they've tried to address the concerns of the local citizenry. There are also conditionalities on who is to operate them over a period of time. So, for example, the standard gauge railway, the Mombasa Nairobi standard gauge railway, there's an agreement that China would run the system over the first 5 years, during which time it would train local operators and then hand over station by station. So they've done that. So now 3 years into the project being completed, most of the systems are run locally. China still supplies the equipment and still runs some of the signaling systems or provides the system, but the operation is now local.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The standard gauge railway is owned by the country. It's not owned by China.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for responding to that. That's good to know also. In a sense, would you say that the motivations, there's a lot of questions about the motives of China in engaging in such a huge multi-year, multi-decade, in fact, projects. I guess, would you be able to sum it as the motivations as a blend of economic as well as political gains? I mean, is China interested in developing and fortifying these relationships for economic as well as political gains? I mean, is that a fair conclusion or?
So to put this in perspective, China is still an emerging country. It has a per capita income of about $10,000 a year. And it could fruitfully, given that level of income, use the funds locally within the country. It's very rare to look anywhere in the world and find a country with $10,000 of per capita income giving out this scale of development finance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's using precious money. These are the savings of its people that are being given to other countries. So a high price is being paid and a high return is expected for these. Now, what are those returns? So one is the development of regions on the western side of China, west and southwest. I showed the map for Myanmar, Yunnan province, Xinjiang province, Xi'an province. So, the number of areas of China which are relatively poor. And one reason they are poor is that they are far from the centers of shipping.
Mm-hmm.
So by opening up the shipping routes, there's a hope that these areas will develop. So that's a big prospective gain for China that is envisaged. From the geopolitical side, China has a certain number of angles. One is a worry that the South China Sea can be controlled by the US. So while China is actively reclaiming land features in the South China Sea and building up its military presence there, it also wants to diversify its supply routes to its main markets, which are Europe and other parts of Asia, so that should the South China Sea ever be an area of confrontation, China would not be stuck with not being able to find ways to export its goods. So the land routes, including land routes through Myanmar, through Pakistan, through Turkey, through Greece, all become very important for it. So that's sort of a geopolitical stroke economic reason.
Mm-hmm.
And then third is the pure political in terms of building its image. I think it recognizes that its system may not be that attractive, but its ability to implement projects within budget and within cost is significant.
Mm-hmm.
I see that as their strategy for building soft power.
Mm-hmm. Rafiq, I'm also interested in spillover effects locally in the countries, individual countries. I mean, so we've had some of these projects for as long as 7 years. Has there been any study providing evidence on the local impact, employment, tax revenues, contribution to, you know, let's say, women entrepreneurs or education and so on? Have there been any you know reliable studies on that, the local impact beyond the particular project that the Chinese have invested in?
So there have been two kinds of studies. One is on how these BRI projects affect the sustainable development goals. So things like gender equity, small business development, environmental issues. That set of studies that I have seen mostly have been done by the UNDP, which has signed an agreement with China to help it make its BRI projects fall under the category of, you know, good quality projects under the Sustainable Development Goals. So far, the evidence I would say is that on the environmental side, there's mixed evidence. In terms of developing small businesses, the evidence is by and large positive. Especially, I mean, but you know, with good and bad aspects, in the sense that these ribbon economies have come up along the corridors of the BRI, and there's substantial movement of population and capital, local capital, to build businesses, housing, and so on, schools around these ribbons. But then with some hollowing out of the areas surrounding the ribbon. So the villages and the areas around it have not been supported with adequate networks of trade and, you know, and transportation around the ribbon to sustain those areas. So there's a loss of biodiversity, there's a hollowing out of remote population. So there is some evidence of that. And China is very concerned about these issues and has committed capital, but it doesn't want to get into development itself. It wants that to be done locally. You know, its strength really is in large infrastructure projects. This has been a problem in Pakistan. When Imran Khan became president, he was unhappy with the very infrastructure focused approach of China and said, I want you to put more resources into agricultural development. And China says, we don't have the resources, we don't have the expertise in that to do it in your country. So they have to work out these things. I think it's still early days, but the early evidence is by and large positive for small business development, some aspects of the SDGs, but not for all.
Very interesting.
Samir, let me just add to this.
Please do, Manuel. I don't want to dominate the discussion.
Have talked about this, and one of the things that has happened is that, you know, small, medium-sized Chinese firms have actually followed, you know, the larger firms to these various countries. And if you look at the economic development story of Southeast Asia, for example, this has been instrumental in developing, for example, supply chains and other industries in Southeast Asia. So we're looking into that, looking at, you know, how it is encouraging, you know, entrepreneurship with Chinese entrepreneurial firms who follows large firms, you know, taking a lead role in that.
Yeah, I might add, Samir, that Ching-Kwan Lee's book that I mentioned on Zambia, she does a lot of work on how Chinese entrepreneurs at the small business end have followed the large state-owned Chinese companies to be ancillary suppliers in the first case, second to build construction projects around the copper mines, and third to partner with local businesses in provision of goods and services. So what Manuel is saying is exactly the pattern that BRI might be expected to follow outside of Southeast Asia as well.
And Manuel, feel free to add your comments and questions. There are a couple of questions, Rafiq, about the future of the BRI. As we look forward, I mean, we're obviously going into another major global recession, which will last for a number of years. What will be the impact of that on the BRI project? Will the financing be as you know, forthcoming as we have seen in the past? What are your predictions on that?
I think in the short term, I don't see that. I see that there has to be a significant impact. China's growth rate this year will fall from 6.1% to maybe 1% at best. It's already seen the first quarter minus 5.8% or 6.8% growth. Second quarter might be minus 2 or 3%. The full year will be 1% at best if there's sort of a V-shaped recovery, which may not happen. So I can't imagine that that will not affect its resource flow. But, that said, its commitment remains. Its BRI has been written into the constitution through an amendment a few years ago. It's now a fundamental feature of Chinese foreign policy. So I see it continuing after this COVID-induced slowdown is over, maybe by 2021, late 2021.
In terms of future, one thing that we're looking into, by the way, our CIBER sponsors a trip to China, looking at developments in the Belt and Road. We were scheduled to have the trip this January. We have to postpone that. As soon as that's available, we will, let you know. And if you are interested, please do let us know. But in terms of future, so we talk about the land and the sea. We're looking at the digital aspects, the so-called digital Silk Road. Right now, again, Rafiq and I have talked about this. That's not very evident yet, but that has to be part, of the equation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's an interesting question from a colleague interested in your thoughts on, Rafiq, on investment, China's investment in media sectors, radio, TV, digital channels. I'm not sure if these been the target of Chinese investment. You can clarify that. And if so, is there a reason for it? I mean, is China gaining soft power through such investments? And again, I'm not sure if there is investment in the media, local media channels.
I also am not aware of investment in local media channels. What I know is that China has historically had a difficult time with the media. So in particularly reading about their experience in Africa, the local media, which is largely English speaking or English language media for the elite audiences, or French, depending on the countries, has tended to take a negative view of the BRI and is full of stories about how poorly China is running projects, the levels of corruption and so on. And it's also been very popular around election time. So the Tanzanian elections took place 2 years ago, and in those elections, one of the planks on which the opposition candidate ran was that China had corrupted the leadership. And when he won the election, he said, these projects are really bad and will ruin Tanzania. They're at uneconomic rates. And of course, a lot of that was nonsense. And the same thing happened in Malaysia and in Sri Lanka, where new governments came in, said these were really bad deals, but then went on and signed even bigger deals to do even more projects with China. Mm-hmm. The fact is, hard to beat a 2% rate, but it does get a lot of bad press. Mm-hmm. It's hard to beat a 2% rate as well as very good implementation. Most Chinese projects come in under cost, within budget, and within the time frame indicated. Example mm-hmm. being the standard gauge railway, which came in a few months early and well within budget. So, but it does get a bad press. I'm not aware of control of the media or investments in media, but I do think there is a problem with its image and how it manages that.
Mm-hmm. A related question comes from Murad Dakhli. In a sense, we haven't heard necessarily much from the US in terms of US policy towards, let's say, Chinese investments in Africa, but some of the strongest opposition to China's investments in Africa has come from former colonizers like the UK and France. I mean, Do you see this to be a major threat? And if they're really worried about Chinese investment in Africa, what is their concern?
I hope they're worried because they should be. You know, but if you think about it from the country point of view, think about it. You have a country, Kenya, that was colonized by the British, who did nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing. I mean, there was one railroad built 100 years ago.
Mm.
And now comes China, and the British are complaining about something that they did nothing about for hundreds of years. So I'm very pleased that I think strategic competition ups the game for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully Britain and France, which are rich countries with a lot of capital, will say, we ought to do some more for Kenya and all these other countries as well.
I believe that Rafiq's report, your working paper is also available.
Yes, it's on the web.
And feel free to contact us or contact Rafiq, if you have, any questions. Yeah, I'll give the last word to Rafiq. Rafiq.
No, thank you very much. It's been a very enjoyable session for me. Great questions. And Tamir, Hannah, Manuel, Rebecca, Karen from UC Denver, Cyber, all of you have made this possible. I've enjoyed it very much, and I'm very happy to continue the dialogue with you. I hope Manuel and you and I can continue doing some research in this area. And I welcome the opportunity to get comments. Hannah has posted the link to my paper on the chat or the Q&A site. So happy to continue the dialogue, and thank you very much.
And thank you again, Rafiq. This has been very, very good. Thank you so much. We've had over 100 people participating this morning with us. And folks, some of the folks asked about the resources. I would start with Rafiq's publication, certainly the paper that he talked about, but also go to some of his other works. Again, RAND Corporation, where Rafiq directs the Center for Asia Pacific. So that's a good place to start.